don't have a patron, but Ms. Owen can present the chairman's bill for him. That would be his pleasure. Otherwise, we could hear Delegate Lamontian's budget amendment and then go to standing legislation. All right. Jim, you want to step up and talk to us about WMATA and your budget amendment? If you would, just give us a 30-second elevator on the current compact situation, your perceptions of it. I know we have members of the standing committee, but we also have members that aren't on the standing committee, and then how your amendment would interface with that or not.
Sure. No, and thank you for the opportunity. This is item 448-1H is the amendment. There's an increasing consensus in the Washington area that the Metro Compact that's been around for 50 years needs to be modified and reformed. I have a joint resolution that goes into the reasons and some of the recommendations in great detail. I won't go into those details today. But the consensus is from groups like the Federal City Council, which is a business civic organization in Washington headed by a former mayor. The Washington Post editorial page, many of us in the General Assembly. And we're looking for revisions on who gets to serve on the board, revisions in the relationship to employees and unions in particular, and just some restructuring on the unfunded pension liability and operations overall. One of the points I'll make, and I won't go into all the details, but if you look at the way the Washington system works, according to the most recent data that's been provided to the Federal Transit Administration, in comparison to the closest comparable transit systems in the United States, which are Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, and Philadelphia, Metro operates at about 50% higher on a per passenger mile cost than the average of those four comparables. And we're just never going to dig out of this unless there's some fundamental reform. This amendment you have here doesn't spell out the reforms. It's what I call my tough love amendment. It basically says you don't get this fixed by April 30th of next year, we're cutting you off. You go find a way to fund yourself. Really, specifically what it means is the localities in Northern Virginia who have members of their local boards of supervisors on the board and are in a position to cause these changes to happen. It's those localities that frankly would be left holding the bag. But the state's going to basically say, you got to clean up your act or we're done. And I wish it frankly hadn't come to this, but that's where we are.
Delegate Lamontian, there's also some federal initiatives in this regard in terms of reforms that are overdue. I know we've reviewed audits over the past several years, performance audits that seem to fail year after year without much change occurring. I understand also that the current CEO is making some progress, but could you speak to a little bit of the things outside of this building that may help you in this effort?
Well, there's the new management team is doing a good job, and at the present time they're digging out from probably 10 or 20 years of neglect of maintenance that's caused some serious safety problems, including the loss of life. They've tried to pursue, in fact, fire a number of employees who falsified safety records, and they're doing the right thing. Unfortunately, there's binding arbitration with this group, not just on money and salaries, but on employment actions, and the unions come back and said, no, you can't fire these guys. And in fact, the arbitrator in one instance said, okay, just give him a back office job, you really have to keep him on salary. And so that's just one example of why this isn't working. Things are better in some respects. We went for 2 or 3 years with audits that did not get a clean audit because the numbers just weren't right. Fortunately, the governor's appointee, Jim Corcoran, who happens to also head the Northern Virginia Chamber of Commerce, was placed as chair of the audit committee and cleaned it up. The most recent audit is clean and it was on time.
Are there questions in the patient budget amendment? In favor of your amendment? Opposed to your amendment? Just so that you know, as a patron, this is an issue that is of concern to us. We want to work with you in this regard and see how we might take a position on Metro overall, as we've been concerned for a number of years. So thank you very much for presenting your budget.
Thank you. I appreciate the committee's taking several steps in recent years to encourage reform, and I think we need to put some more teeth in it, and that's why this amendment was offered.
Thank you, Doug. Kelly Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 2448.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Okay. This has two components to relieve congestion in certain areas of the Commonwealth. One is to shift to lane miles driven, or the means of computing how much money each area will get. And what that means is 50% of the certain transportation fund money would be allocated that way. The other 50% would be allocated according to the current formulas. It also would give a 50% tax credit to anybody who uses tolls on I-66. Now, why did I do this? Last year, when these tolls were being considered, my wife urged Delegate Habib, and I'm just following her instructions, to
She's your number one constituent.
that's right, so I've got to pay attention to her. Appreciate that. To hold a hearing in Northern Virginia before tolls would be imposed. Well, no such courtesy was given, and tolls are imposed, and they were done in a very unique way with the inclusion of an entire bill in the budget. I've never seen that in 25 years here. Don't know if I'll see it again. It's legal, but it's highly unorthodox. At the VDOT hearings that I attended, and I attended a number of them, 98% of the individuals were against tolls without being told how much they would cost at all. Only recently, I think at this early December meeting, did the Secretary of Transportation acknowledge, or rather he did not dispute, that measuring the tolls on I-66 by the amounts that were paid on I-95 was comparable. When I wrote to VDOT, Helen Corvo, who's the resident engineer up there, said we can't disclose the actual amount of tolls because that would place us at a competitive disadvantage. Mobility Partners has been chosen to build these expensive hot lanes. I asked for the citizens to be told on the I-66 bulletin boards that tolls were coming. That was never done. While Mobility Partners was declared to be the best company out there to do this by the governor, I want to let you know that in 2014, Mobility Partners went bankrupt on the toll road they were operating in Indiana, and in Texas, they went bankrupt on State Route 125 in 2016. If that's the best, God help us from seeing the worst. I am not aware that any surveys were taken of actual toll road users for the amounts that are predicated to drive the road during high drive time, and that's the main time that you have to worry about it. The market plan data, I'd like to know what that is. I wrote the Secretary of Transportation today, and I said, please tell me the assumptions that you are using that you think will take current drivers off of the untolled 4 lanes right now, in both directions, to go onto the tolled lanes. There's going to be 2 lanes in each direction. We're going to lose 1 untolled lane. And I showed the picture today that we took on Saturday when we went down to Fairfax. Traffic is going to get worse unless you do something, unless you provide some incentive to pay this $92 a day toll, and that figure is really not in dispute. I don't know who's going to use this, and the traffic will get much worse. I just hope that you will do something, because absent this, a person driving from Haymarket to Washington, 25 miles from Haymarket to Washington, and then the 8.5 miles inside the Beltway, is going to pay $17 a day, high drive time in the morning and evening for inside the Beltway, and $75 a day outside the Beltway. That's $92 a day, $23,000 a year for a 50-week work year. I don't know of anybody who could afford that. Maybe Donald Trump can, but I can't. So I just hope that you will take to heart some portion of this into consideration. And I do disagree with the fiscal implication down here on that this might encumber the Commonwealth from sending out receipts that you use for I-66. Just like any other tax deduction, exemption, or credit that you receive, you should submit a document. I paid so much to Easy Pass, and this is what it was for. So if you have any questions, I will answer them.
Thank you, Delegate Marshall. We also heard your floor speech today regarding similar concerns. The fiscal impact also makes reference to the tax credit portion of the bill, which estimates over $500 million negative impact to the Commonwealth. I don't know if you had a budget amendment that would correspond to the legislation or not. I didn't see one in our files.
There's no impact this year because Mobility Partners will not finish building the tolls, if they still go ahead with this, until about 2020 or 2021. So there can't be an impact on that. There would be an impact whenever VDOT finishes constructing the tolls inside the Beltway. So $500 million is further down the road.
I believe it takes effect January 1st of 2017 is what I read.
Inside the Beltway.
Yeah, inside.
And if it's $500 million a year, I don't believe
The other
that.
component is the lane miles. That's a fundamental shift in
Correct.
how we do things now. Do you have a kind of an idea of who the winners and losers are statewide if we were to shift?
Urban areas would be winners.
Urban areas would be winners.
Northern Virginia, Tidewater.
Secretary is here. I'm sure y'all can catch up after. So there's questions of the patron and legislation.
The calculation of all that someone might pay assumes that they're choosing to get into the pay lanes every day, every year, and guaranteeing at least 45 miles an hour all over the city. So it's not like they're not getting anything. That's what they get for paying tolls every day instead of finding 2 more people to get in their car or riding in a bus for free.
Unlike I-95, where there are heavy concentrations of employers like the Pentagon, there are no single employers on the western side of Prince William and Fairfax that can attract easily people to get 3 in a car. That is the distinction. And the quote choice you have is to go on, instead of 4 lanes, and again, I know it's time constrained in the morning, but I've got pictures that we took in the afternoon around 1:30, going to Fairfax from Prince William and coming back. The green arrow lanes were operative, both going, where we had a meeting at 2 o'clock and I got down to Fairfax at 1:30, and coming back when we were leaving at about 3:30. So that is what it is right now. When this changes, there's only going to be 3 lanes. There won't be a green arrow lane. You are really constricting traffic and causing congestion in Northern Virginia. You're not alleviating it by doing this. I mean, to me, if you look at eminent domain as an ethical issue, not just one of the government taking it for private, the government, Commonwealth of Virginia, is taking lanes away from citizens and not compensating them, because my choice of paying $92 a day or sitting in more traffic is not really a choice. It's not effective, just compensation.
Further questions of the delegate? Anyone speak in favor of your legislation? Anyone opposed to this legislation would like to address the committee? Secretary.
I had hoped, I told Dr. Marshall, I hoped I'd get through one session in my term that I wouldn't have to speak against one of his bills, but I'm back in purgatory. But in the first part of the bill,
You're in good
about
company.
the lane mile changes, 70% of cities around the Commonwealth or localities would be impacted. Delegate Marshall's right, it would heavily favor Northern Virginia, and particularly your district, sir. But I think that's
I represent them.
yes, sir. I have no problem with that. In terms of the other part about 66, I'm not going to relitigate. I will respond to Delegate Marshall's again letter. I don't know, it's the 10th or 11th one, but anyway, we'll respond. 14th. We will respond. I did want to mention, though, I did brief the entire House Appropriations on the safeguards put into the contract on 66. And of course, this is dynamic pricing. And Douglas, it was your right. That changes up and down, and what our experience has been, it's not everyday users. It is people who choose to use that, because if the free lanes are open, we'd assume that they would stay in those. So, for those reasons, we would oppose the bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any comments or questions? Questions? Delegate Garrett.
Delegate Marshall, I truly and sincerely appreciate your persistent and consistent representation of your district, and I say that quite sincerely. You have been a staunch advocate, and your voice has been heard and certainly needs personally have a challenge because in my district, I feel and understand I would be disadvantaged by folks. But I said that congestion is not our big problem. I also have concerns over sort of the fiscal impact. So for that, Mr. Chairman, I would
wait, if you're gonna make a motion after state, Delegate Rush.
I was gonna say, I too appreciate Delegate Marshall's persistent representation of his constituents. I'm gonna represent mine. And, since the delegate himself said that my district would come out on the losing end of this deal, I would be voting.
Delegate Garrett. You were motioning to lay the bill on the table. Delegate Rush.
I'm sorry, what was the motion?
Lay the bill on the table.
Who made that?
Delegate Garrett, seconded by Delegate Rush. Any discussion on the motion? It's not debatable. All in favor indicate by saying aye. All opposed. Thank you, Delegate Marshall.
I got one more card I'm gonna play.
Thank you. The 15th letter. And would you like to present the chairman's bill for him that also relates in part to some of the subject matter we've just considered in terms of C3?
Certainly, you have before you an appropriation substitute to House Bill 2244. That is mine, not in the system.
All in favor indicate by saying aye. All opposed.
This bill seeks to build upon the legislative reforms that were enacted in the 2015 session relating to the PPTA by codifying some of the administrative reforms that VDOT has used since that time. It resulted in some positive outcomes for both the taxpayers and the private sector. Going quickly section by section, the first 33.2.1801 strengthens the requirement that PPTAs are used only for projects when it is in the best interest of the public, as opposed to simply being in the public interest, intended to ensure that public dollars are spent wisely and investments made on the highest priority roadways. Second section 33.2.1803 regarding the approval by the responsible public entity specifies how it can be determined that a project is in the best interest of the public, requires that P3 be used only when the private entity can develop and operate the facility with a lower public contribution than the public contribution determined by the agency that they would be able to build it. Also requires that the projects be included in the long-range plans. In terms of the finding of public interest, requires the responsible public entity to issue that prior to calling the PPTA steering committee that was established back in 2015 to meet. It also requires that the secretary would confirm and concur with that finding of public interest. There's a new section 33.2.1803.1:1. This is one of the major items of the legislation that would require that as part of the consideration of any PPTA proposal, VDOT and DRPT must ensure continued competition throughout the process by maintaining a viable public sector option against which to measure the private proposals, and would require the Secretary of Finance to work in development of the financing assumptions, and that such analysis specifically address any mitigation of risk related to competing facilities charges or any compensation for high HOV usage on lines 209 to 11. It would require the responsible public entity to determine in advance whether the project would be a design build or a concession type arrangement to ensure that the cost and risk are properly assessed and also ensure a level playing field for the private proposers. In terms of the Transportation Public-Private Steering Committee, this code section is rewritten to specify the first purpose of the committee is to evaluate and review the financing options. Makes no change to the board membership, but it does establish the committee would meet first prior to the initiation of any procurement to review the public sector option and analyze that it was fully and reasonably developed and evaluate the assumptions that were included regarding transfer risk and proposed term sheets. There would be a second meeting of the committee that's similar to the current one existing in code that would require them to meet after the RFQ, but prior to the issuance of any draft RFP to determine that the responses look as though they're in the best interest of the public. Amends the public meeting requirements to allow for closed sessions to review proprietary information. This is under existing FOIA exemptions. And then it would add a final meeting of the committee where they would review for informational purposes only the final bids received and the details of the evaluation entered into by the department. That last section of the bill amends current code provisions which allow for interim agreements under the PPTA to ensure that VDOT and DRPT, these are not used as a vehicle for competitive negotiations with a single party.
Thank you, Ann. Are there questions of staff about the legislation?
Mr. Chairman, perhaps this is best for the Secretary. I've never sat down on these negotiation tables, and certainly not recent, but I've seen you have, sir. So could you just tell me, in just very simplistic layman's terms, in a minute, what is the private, what would the average private vendor like with these changes, and what would that individual not like with these changes, in general?
In general, we did work with the private industry because we want to make sure that it's a fair playing field. So their concerns at first were that this public option that we were developing would be a target that was unrealistic. That's not the purpose at all. In fact, that's why we have the committee getting involved to make sure that it's a real public option. So when they know that they're going to be negotiating, they first of all have a real target to deal with. So they had some concerns about that. I think we've alleviated working with them in that regard. That was their major concern. Or the other related to that would be they would be spending money. That information would be gathered to be used against them, where they would give us information and we would develop it. And we said no, we wouldn't go out with an RFP until the state ought to come up with its own plan. But the advisory committee looking at it and make sure that it was a real plan. But we certainly wouldn't have them spend money to compete against themselves. And then we went out for the the actual proposal when they started spending real money, because they'll spend millions of dollars to respond to this. They knew what the target was, and it was a realistic target.
Thank you. Additional questions? Thank you. Mr. Secretary, while you're there, would you just like to speak to the bill as amended?
Yes, and Ms. Oman really did a very good homage. It basically is putting into law what we went through on 66. With trying to improve it, particularly in the case, Delegate Garrett, what I just talked to you about, making sure that the public option was truly vetted. In this case, some could say we were conservative because they beat it significantly. I don't mean to suggest that that was the case, but we wanted to make sure it was truly vetted and there was a real, the state could produce it if in fact the private parties could not. So it's putting into that, it establishes a further communications with the advisory committee to make sure that, again, once we've gone out, we have to recertify. It specifically identifies the most egregious parts of P3 legislation we've had to deal with in the past. That is alternative facilities charges or restrictions on our ability to build things in the future. It also defines that this project has to be in the public interest, not just a public purpose. Because many things could be a public purpose, but it wouldn't be in the public interest. And it also, we've done away with interim agreements, not totally, but the ones where you only have sole source negotiations, we've done away with those because there's really no reason why we shouldn't have competitive bidding all the way through. So that's Mr. Chairman, that's really the highlights of it.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And there's nothing in the bill that would change your obligation to certify along the way.
No, actually, I think, in fact, without this public option, I don't know how I could certify, standing in front of you and say that it was in the best interest. It could have been a purpose, but not the best interest. So, no, I think it actually strengthens that certification, sir.
And the sign-off, Mr. Secretary, from the P3 committee being pushed to later in the process relates to that point, or could you just speak to that?
Well, it actually, first of all, they'll have the earlier sign-off on the public option, and then saying that they do agree that this is the appropriate public option to use and comparing. And then the other is exactly before we go off, we've gone and did our work and said we think it's in our best interest to send this out for a concession because we believe what we're really talking about is who's going to finance the project now. That's really what we're talking about, whether it's private financing or whether it is public financing. And because we can always go do a design build, we can also take advantage of all the other efficiencies from the contracting community. But like in 66, we found out when we went out, they significantly beat it, and they should be able to, on a level playing field, because their ability to take risks on certain things far exceed the state's, and it should, quite frankly, in terms of how they do it. So it would come at the second sign-off, as Ms. Oman pointed out, would be right before the RFP, and then I have to come back as secretary, or whomever's here will come back as secretary and have to certify that if we actually did it, it was exactly what we told the committee it would be.
And so in a nutshell, it's to encourage the private investment only when it's in the best interest of the public.
That's correct, yes, sir.
Further questions of the secretary?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Doug, say
Yeah, I would just, wanted to understand the interim agreement section where you shall not establish a process of timing and negotiations in agreement or, allow competitive negotiations. Did you just explain that one more time?
Yeah, no,
Why those sound like good things to me.
the definition of interim agreement has broad, and we didn't want to eliminate some of the definitions, but in the case you're speaking of is, I'll use the downtown Midtown tunnel. We got to a sole source, an interim agreement that limited us to a sole source.
Okay.
And we went from that point forward. So that's all we're talking about eliminating. It's not that we wouldn't have an interim agreement once we bid it and we've reached agreement with somebody and we want to start early work. It's saying you can't get to that conclusion without at least looking at all your other alternatives.
But, no, I think that section is also designed to address, in that circumstance, these one-on-one negotiations.
That's correct.
Something that was a problem in that regard, so.
In effect, and it does chill, quite frankly, getting unsolicited proposals. But that would be our purpose to do so, because if we got it unsolicited, we would go through this process.
Okay. Is there anyone here who would like to speak in favor of the chairman's bill? Is there anyone opposed to the chairman's bill? Not there is a motion. There's a motion and a second to recommend reporting of House Bill 2244 as amended. All in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. All opposed. Thank you very much. It concludes our business.